Welcome to the Chief Future Officer podcast. In this podcast, we explore the evolving role of the CFO. My name is Indus Khaitan. I'm your host, and today we are joined by a seasoned finance executive, Scott Meyers. Scott Meyers is the CFO of React Gaming Group. Scott, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Indus.
So, Scott, jumping into your career, you've spent time at Schneider. Now you are the CFO of React. Take down your own memory lane and tell us your journey as undergrad, as a high schooler. Is finance you wanted to be in?
I didn't know, I would say. I think I actually had this dream where I wanted to go into the FBI when I was younger. And one of the things that you could get into the FBI with was an accounting degree. And so I went that route when I went into college. And it just so happened like I was fortunate enough to live in a state that had a great accounting school. So went to the University of Illinois. Um, and somewhere between kind of going and leaving, I ended up on this finance career. And I was a little bit different because I just didn't want to go into audit right away. I looked at audit and I was like, this seems very, this seems like a lot of work and not a lot of like pay. Maybe in retrospect, I wouldn't have that opinion, but went straight into what they call in industry in a lot of places, which is, somewhat unusual. I knew one other person, I think, in my career that did that. But yeah, so I didn't want to end up there. And then finally, like, just kind of fell on that path. And then from there, it really took off. I kind of divide my career in two different phases. So first phase is with a big company, Schneider Electric, and then got to a point there where, my wife and I are juggling careers. And I'm like, I'd like to try something different because after, so long with a company, and I find this happens usually with professionals at the 10-year mark, like even when there's a fire, you're like, okay, I know where the extinguisher is. I know who to call. I know what we do when the mess is over. It kind of gets, you want to test yourself and do something more. And so I ended up going into these small and mid-cap companies in Canada. And, that was, I would say, definitely a risky move, but I feel like I learned a ton from that.
You mentioned about audit, and many of our guests in the previous season, barring a few, as you mentioned, they start their careers as audit, somewhere large, big four. And is this like a convention that's pretty much written down, or there are other paths like yours, like there are more paths like yours?
I think, it depends where you are. So I'm in Canada now. I grew up in the US. In the US, I think it's a little bit more open. In Canada, there's definitely like you need to go into audit and get like the path is pretty much there. I do think there's other ways to get there. I know CFOs that have actually not gone even in a traditional accounting and finance role and learned it later. I think that's rare, and it's in certain industries. It is mainly you do need to kind of get in at some level. Personally, it's worked for me not to go that path, but I don't think it's, like I said, in retrospect, like it's not necessarily bad to have that discipline because they really do teach you how to like be an accountant in the audit profession. And if not for that, almost think about it as some sort of like a postgraduate education that you get paid for. Like you're kind of a grad student, actually. You know how they say like grad students, they kind of just like mistreat and pay low and whatnot. And some of that's changing in the industry, but it's kind of was the case for a while. So it's somewhat similar. And again, you can go into other companies or you can go into banking. I mean, there's other paths you can take. I think the most important is get your accounting degree and then, decide. There's definitely things that if I was coaching my past self, I would tell myself to do differently for sure.
And you grew up in Chicago. How was childhood like?
Well, and just to be clear, I grew up in the suburbs, but I say Chicago because nobody knows the Chicago suburbs. But it was, it was like a great childhood. It's safe and boring place to grow up, which is actually what you want when you're a kid. It's, I would say that boring side, definitely a lot of people wanted to escape and do something different. So you go to school someplace else, and like me, escape the country after a while of being, I guess, in Illinois too much. I kind of joke though, like most of Chicago moved to Phoenix at some point because you just get tired of the weather. It's tornadoes in the summer and freezing cold winters and snow, and just you kind of like go to Arizona and you're like, ah, it's just hot. I can deal with this, you know.
And you're still dreaming about FBI when you were young?
No, I think that's past. You know, and part of it probably is like when I was in college, you know, it's when 9/11 happened, and like I think the my guess is, and I don't know too many people in you know in this area or know of, like my parents were in, or my one side of my dad's family was in all in law enforcement, but I think it changed a little bit from, you know, there was a lot of counterterrorism stuff, and really what that is code for is like listening to phone calls for hours on end. So um, you know, I could have a different picture of it because, like I said, I wasn't doing it, but it definitely like the mood I think changed a little bit. And you know, when you're a kid and dreaming of a job, and then you kind of learn out what it actually means. Sometimes you don't always want to know what your dream job entails, right?
And how was your first job? How did you land into one?
Yeah, so my first job actually was for this company called Spiegel. I think some people might know them. You might know the company Eddie Bauer.
Yeah.
So Spiegel was actually bankrupt, and they were recruiting. So it was kind of it was a weird place to start, you know, for a company that basically is in, you know, bankruptcy reorganization. But it was actually great because one, I worked with some great people there. I like, you know, I still think of them as kind of like, wow, I was lucky to work with all these people that, you know, had these strong backgrounds, and, you know, I think like just kind of hit the right timing. And then two, you know, when a company goes bankrupt, I mean, they ultimately had an asset they could wind out, but you know, I would almost encourage people, like if you get that opportunity early on, go do it, because if you're ambitious and you want to learn things, you can pick up stuff, and kind of as the company is winding down, you're going to get newer and newer tasks. So it's almost like a reverse boot camp, if you will. Because I remember starting with kind of just small stuff as you do when you're you know starting out, and then like the you know as long as you can take on more and more stuff, like you're pretty safe, because somebody ultimately needs to kind of shut the doors and close the key, and it's usually one of the accountants. It's kind of the last person. Like I did say though, the entity did spin some stuff out, but the initial entity, Spiegel, actually, I think the ultimate fate is somebody who like buys brands bought it, but it's no longer, as far as I know.
And how easy or difficult was it to get the first one?
I think it was difficult because I had no clue what I was doing. So and that's like the honest truth is like you're like I have no idea what I'm doing, and keep in mind this was, you know, almost 20 years ago, so like it was before LinkedIn, before, you know, it was basically you need to find a recruiter, you need to like you're looking, like you still literally would look in classified ads for jobs, like you use the newspaper. um you know, the internet wasn't as big of a thing. There was job boards, but there was still like everything. So, you know, you're looking for that. Like I said, I would have done things a lot differently. I think, you know,
Like a
really
newspaper, like actually going
like
down
like a piece of paper that has like stuff printed on it. Like, yeah, crazy, you know, crazy, right? Like you think like it completely died. Like I hate when I get mail now, you know, like I don't even want like real mail. But yeah, I didn't find this job out there. I found it through a recruiter. I think it was Robert Half. Like they're a pretty big recruiting firm in Canada and the US. Um, Actually, I'm pretty sure it was through them, but ultimately, like, you, it took, you know, just kind of grinding through that to get that job. Yeah.
got it. And then from Spiegel, you went to Komatsu, and then from Komatsu to Schneider, and spent quite a bit of time at Schneider.
Yeah, Schneider's a great company. I mean, they're, you know, one, they're huge and nobody knows about them usually. So the one thing I tell people is like, if you're in the US or can't, if you're anywhere in the world and you go to your circuit breaker box, you probably have a Schneider breaker, like 1 out of 3 shot, probably, roughly. Some places, you know, it's probably all that. Like if you're in France, it's probably all that's there. If you're, you know, in like Canada, you're probably 1 out of 3. US, maybe 1 out of 2. And you know, they have this big business that's a lot more than that too. But that's kind of where I start people from. They're they're really mature in their finance process and accounting processes as well. They have a lot of smart people that put together those I would say modern reporting before it was modern reporting. Um, and you know, I'm sure like any company, they have rooms for improvement, but that's, you know, they're a good place to learn. So, you know, I guess if you're young and you get an offer there in any country, I would say go take it. Um, and I had a lot of opportunity there to kind of move through the organization. You know, I've changed countries, and it was a good place to kind of build a foundation of just everything that you needed to learn in finance.
And if you could talk to us about your breeding at Schneider in terms of your explorations and things that you got really good at versus what you started at,
Yeah, and like I would say, when you're like you don't know what you don't know. So started there, did consolidation accounting, and then there was this group called FP&A, and I was like, I don't even know if those guys know what they're doing. Like, this is my young kind of way more arrogant, like I know everything type rule, and been since humbled multiple times. But and then was lucky that the manager there, like, because we had a good relationship with that team. They used a lot of our data from the consolidation side. I learned a lot about period consolidations. Was kind of my life for a couple of years. And then he's like, hey, do you want to come over? And came over to that role. They had a lot of things to kind of fix and build up. So unfortunately, I think with FP&A teams, there's usually like somebody builds a team and then somebody else takes it over. And then the team sometimes just like everybody leaves, because I think your shelf life in financial planning and analysis is like 2 or 3 years. Because either it's just not the job for you and you're not right at it, or after 2 years you kind of know everything, and it gets kind of like, it gets repetitive and boring. And then people that do really well in it tend to not be like the people that want to be in a repetitive, boring role. So there's a lot of high turnover, and then the team's kind of quality goes up and down. And I joined on that downside, which it was a ton of work. But at the same time, I think we were able to make things move a lot faster. Like, I remember one time there's a forecast process. So what you like every quarter you're putting in your forecast numbers, and like the quarter before, the team was really struggling to get it in. I think they were like there till 2 a.m. And I'm like, no way, because I'm not one of these people that revels in working until 2 a.m. I think it's kind of like it's a good way to do your worst work. And yeah, like it's really challenging. So I was like, okay, I know this is a problem. I'm going to prepare for it, right? Like my young mind. And we were preparing for it, had everything going well. It was a lot of work to get to that point. But then we were done by noon that day, and we're like, wait, we're done? Like, okay, I guess, we're just going to go get lunch now. So I think, that was a great opportunity to learn. Like, one is just not every challenge has to be a challenge. And I'm sure you get this multiple fields, right? I'm sure in your field, not everything has to be hard. You can figure out how it's easy. And that, was kind of one of those situations.
Do you think the finance titles vis-a-vis what the work actually goes into it needs to evolve a lot? Because at least as a product engineer, I have seen that it's no longer just a software engineer title. It is, DevOps or front end or back end or UI design, UX design, product managers.
Yeah.
The keywords that did not or were not present 15 years ago are now in full force. You'll find hundreds and thousands of job listings on LinkedIn. But I have not seen, or at least talking to many finance leaders like you, I have not seen that evolution. Like, let's say they had a job 15 years ago and you hit the nail and right on saying, hey, FP&A, but it's still the same FP&A. Why it is not three different roles as planning, analysis, forecasting? Why it is still FP&A?
I think some of it's tradition. And, it's like we have these things. I think some of it is you only have so big of a team. So even in a huge global company, you're going to have you only have so much headcount. So it's hard to split up all these roles. Somebody inevitably ends up taking on more work or like different pieces of it. And, part of it is, I think you have certain people that are just, they have skills in certain areas, and they tend to end getting all the work in those areas. And it doesn't always cleanly fit into certain buckets. I know in software I've heard this before. Like, this guy's a front end developer, but he really only knows these three things really well and doesn't know this thing. And then we go over here, and Jane over here does that one thing that everybody else doesn't know how to do, and we don't let her touch the other stuff because she's kind of bad at it. But when you're looking at a team, sometimes you figure out who plays what position the best, and you associate there. I will say one of the things I've been lucky, and certain managers would say, here's the 10 things or the 5 things you need to know like in these types of roles, and let's make sure that you get exposure to all of those, so that by the time you're done with that role, you at least know how to do all these things. And that's kind of a good way of looking at it, at least in finance. And yeah, do the roles line up? Not at all. I think, you know, I've seen like controller can mean different things. You know, if you're at a small company, sometimes controller is like glorified bookkeeper. And if you're in a large company, the controller could be really like the CFO or CEO's right hand. Like there's such a wide variety in what that means. It's I think hard to go from company to company. You really just have to look at what is this person doing. And even that'd be my advice for people in a career. Like, don't let your title limit you. Like, look at the work you're doing and position yourself, with that, with your abilities and skills, or look at what skills do I need to get, where I want to go.
Interesting. And then from Schneider, a few years down the road, you are at React Gaming. You are the CFO. Tell us a little bit more about React. What does it do? How big is the team?
Yeah, so React's a small cap company here in Canada, publicly listed on the TSX Venture. It has three main activities. So one, we own a gambling site called Loot.bet, and that's centered around esports gambling. There's other offers there, but that's the main thesis. Another is we own a site called Compete.gg, and that one is a tournament site. So we're building towards basically you and I could play any game and have any sort of tournament on it. That's the investment thesis behind there. And then we have an esports team called Parabellum. So, a couple of years ago, probably like 6 months before I ended up joining React, they said, okay, we want to start pivoting this company that was a marketing company and turn it into a esports company. And that happens a lot here in Canada. It's kind of different than you think, like NASDAQ listed or whatnot. The venture exchange is really for, like, I would say, ventures. It's kind of a response, I think, to allow companies a public offering without having kind of the restrictions of being, let's say, a NASDAQ listed company or a New York Stock Exchange. So you should definitely consider it a junior kind of listing service. Still has the rigors of public, but different animal. I think just to kind of level set for people from the US, that there's not, I think it's not as big of a thing in the US. You have OTC markets, but still not as like prevalent as this in Canada. To the point where some US companies actually list on these ventures to go public. So you have US listed companies and TSX. But yeah, to get back to the company, it's, we really put together these assets and are testing out an investment thesis and seeing where it goes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's next for you from here?
Well, I think, the goal here, like most smaller companies, is to see, like, okay, how far can we take this? In terms of my career, like, I wish I could tell you, like, oh, I know where exactly I'm going to be in 5 years. Because there was a point in my life where I didn't know I was going to be in Canada. And by the way, in those 5 years, I was going to live in France for 2 years. So, probably my life's not as dynamic as it can be now. Like different things have changed on my personal side. Been married, like, we're juggling 2 careers. That's a little different, but at the same time, you still, like, you never know. My goal is to keep kind of pushing my career forward, because I'm not one of these people that likes to sit there and do nothing. So whether we grow either React or eventually, like, on the venture, a lot of these companies get bought, or we'll see where that goes. I really am just happy where I can jump in and start adding value from a leadership perspective, and get a team together and develop people, because it's one of the things I think it's really rewarding, is just being able to take people further in their careers. Not everybody, of course, is like, you got to start with the right raw ingredients, but helping people move along is for sure, like, at least in my mind, it feels a little bit, I've had a lot of people do that for me, and I want to return that favor kind of forward.
Very interesting. You mentioned briefly you traveled, you spent some time outside of North America.
Mm-hmm.
How was that experience?
I think, I would say it's eye-opening. So, I mean, I'm sure maybe you have similar, because you mentioned you were, you didn't grow up in the US per se, and you have this, and I say eye-opening because, when you're from one place, you're used to one set of things and one set of cultures. And when you go even to some, like, you would think, okay, France, it's Western, or even Canada, it's like practically US, but there's actually differences in the culture that you have to, like, either they kind of smack you in the face, or you need to back up and say, okay, like what am I missing here? And I think it helps you be a lot more in tune person with just what's going on in general, and like, oh, people have different opinions and they think differently. I mean, a lot of this, you can even say, even in the US, moving from like, I don't know, East Coast to West Coast or something, you're going to have a different set of cultures and norms, and even greater. Um, it definitely gives me a lot more appreciation for things like people that have to deal with, English as a second language. I mean, my French is still pretty horrible. Um, Although, like, they'll hate me if I say this, I think that Quebec French is a lot easier to understand, like as an Anglophone, than the French. But it's it it's it's a challenge, and I think it's good to get that like humility of just saying, okay, not everybody is going to be perfect at English or whatever, but you can still um, give them the benefit of the doubt and allow people to surprise you. So that was a good piece. I think just seeing different parts of the world too, and having time to actually live in a culture, it gives you a different set of assumptions that you can test. Like, what am I thinking that I assume that maybe not right, or what can be a little bit better. I mean, I'll tell you, one of my favorite things about France in general is that it's perfectly okay to sit on a patio and sip a coffee for 3 hours and just let life go by. I find that like one of the most relaxing things. Probably bores the heck out of other people, but you can do that there. And it's something that I wouldn't have even thought of as an option, like in North America, because pretty much we're like, all right, get the coffee, go to work, go do stuff, go do the next thing, like, get my workout in. There's not always that time to just like sit back and relax.
So I'm sure then your colleagues over there found you more imposing because, hey, I gotta go get this business done. No, I gotta go home.
I don't know. I think we'd have to ask them, but for sure, especially like because just picture like a younger, more energetic, driven person. Like it's that was also something that I had to dial back a little bit. But you kind of like learn a lot about yourself as well, and you have different kind of mirrors, I would say, to reflect yourself upon. I think it also gives you a little bit more resilience. I mean, I think you don't realize how spoiled you are until you kind of just have to be throw yourself into a different environment and test yourself. And I won't say like France is a super hard environment, but there's definitely things that just like I have goofy stories, and there's actually like, if you want to get a there's a good book called it's called A Year in the Merde. I hope I can say that word on the podcast, but it's basically this guy from England, and he goes to France, and like living there, I've cried laughing in parts of that book because it's kind of like some of the stuff he's writing about is true. And I'm sure it happens everywhere. Like I kind of want to know I'd love to read like the American version of like a French person going to America and just seeing what's so odd, or even Canada. So yeah, it's a good way to just kind of open yourself up as a person.
Any goofiest workplace story other than this one?
Oh, goofiest at work, or like goofy France stories? I mean, I remember one time, like, I think the first day there, I was trying to get a Metro pass. And I went to one place that I was told to go, and they're like, no, we don't sell them here. Then I go to another place. And keep in mind, my French at this point was like, it was terrible, like very broken, just trying to get through. And then you went to the other place, and they said, no, actually, you need to go back to the place you were at. Went back to the place I was at. They're like, no, everything's wrong. So then I just said, all right, I'm just going to buy a normal ticket and I'll sort out the Metro Pass. So I finally went, and then I was just like, you know what, I'm early, because I didn't realize like everybody starts there at like 9:30, and I'm usually the late one starting at 8:30. Like that's kind of where I was at, Midwest, like 7:30, 8 o'clock. And you have people that are like insane and they get to work at like 6. Like it's just, different culture. So I thought, and I was early, so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go. And I checked at the station that was near the work, and they're like, oh yeah, here you go. Here's your pass. Like, no problem. Didn't need anything. And sometimes stuff there, it just kind of like that. I look like, it was kind of frustrating at the time, but I look at it now, and it's just kind of like I have an appreciation for it. In terms of goofy, like, yeah, the first day I showed up at 8:30, and like I think somebody came in early at 9 and was very kind and showed me around. So that was it was like just certain little things.
Yeah, I'm sure many of our habits, and of course now mine. So I grew up in India,
Yeah.
and then when I go back, and sometimes friends find me aggressive because I'm trying to do a time check on everything. Oh, we're done. Oh, let's go. Oh, and India is again like a little bit, I would not use the word lazy, but laid back. Yeah, we'll get it
Right.
done, we'll achieve, we'll accomplish. But why are you in a hurry?
Yeah. Well, even like I moved recently from Toronto to Calgary, and just it's even Toronto's like a lot more East Coast, a little bit more like time sensitive, rushing around, tons more traffic. And Calgary still gets stuff done, but it just feels like everybody here is a lot more relaxed about it. Like there's just there's just not that amped up level that you get, and I could see the difference because at first, like because Chicago is probably even more amped up than Toronto, and then you go to New York, um, and New York's like the probably the most amped up. Like even people I know from New York that have left for a few years, you talk to them and like even if they don't have the accent, they were from New York. You're like, you grew up in New York, didn't you? Because they're boom, 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 high energy level goes. Yeah,
I think we see that change in the last couple of years because of COVID and stuff. But
yeah,
the basic element of, okay, got to get things done on time, that remains.
yeah. And we'll see how long it takes the changes to unwind. Because I don't know about you, but I've noticed a lot of there's a big kind of swing towards remote work and work from home and a little bit more balance. And now I'm noticing that a lot of companies are like, okay, let's come back to the office and really like kind of I don't know if I would call it back to normal, but maybe there's kind of like a swing back on the pendulum to more like pre-COVID type work environments. I'm not sure if you're seeing that on your end out where you're at, but definitely seeing that more and more.
We are. In fact, I was reading something came on my Twitter feed that Apple is basically reprimanding employees who do not show up at least 3 days at work.
Mm.
And exactly don't remember like how they're going to do it, but essentially managers are doing a report where people who have not badged in for 3 days, continuously over a period of month, they are going to be, somehow
They'll get
warned
into
or
merit.
noticed, or yeah.
They'll get another bite out of the apple.
Yeah, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
happening more and more, I think. Plus, the overall tech economy has softened, valuations are down. So, quote unquote, employers now have more leverage than they did when the market was very hot and frothy. I think that's also kind of driving that change.
Yeah, there's probably some uncomfortableness too. I mean, like the market dynamics have really changed, right? Interest rates have gone up, so it's not like money isn't free anymore. And on top of that, you have a lot of baby boomers retiring. So I think there's just a lot of new, quote unquote, new dynamics. Like we had this, if you look backwards, you're like, oh, we had this nice 20-year period of growth and stability. And now we're kind of exiting that into like a newer environment. And anytime something new happens, like, there's always this unsettling period. I mean, looking back, right, there's a housing crisis. Canada, actually, the oil price dropping really impacted it and the dollar. And you get through it. It's not always as bad as you think it is, and it's not always as good as you think it is on both sides. But yeah, we'll see how this new dynamic happens. I'm like curious how it's going to play out. Um, and yeah, a lot of tech layoffs just happened. But I think also if you looked at their hiring trends, they may have overhired, which unfortunately, when you're a large company, it's hard and harder to get that scale and growth at massive Microsoft and Apple levels. I mean, how do they get bigger? Like, what else can they possibly do?
How do you forecast this? Where do we gonna go? Where are we gonna go in the next 12 to 18 months?
I mean, when I think of forecasting, so one is like usually your forecast is wrong the second day you have your forecast out. You have about a day, and then something will happen. Um, it depends on the industry. I think I really think you should use forecast as kind of a tool to say like, what are my assumptions and what are we basing it on? And then you go through some time and you say, okay, was I right or wrong on these assumptions? It's almost a learning tool. And you you need that tool because if you're not doing it, you could repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
Hmm.
In terms of like how do you forecast like demographic shift? I mean, I think you just make your best educated guess. Like my hunch would be I would actually see like my guess is we'll see more salary inflation still. I know you could, like, there was a lot of tech layoffs, but I think just in general, a lot of baby boomers are exiting the market, and there's a lot of just demand for labor in general. And it's probably not going to be uniform across all environments, but my guess is finding, especially that higher end expertise level, is going to get harder and harder to find for a while. And I think also that base level labor is pretty hard as well, and that's going to drive a lot of inflation. Um, I also think you have another inflation driver, which is going to be housing. So
Hmm.
you're in the Bay Area, right? I
Yeah.
mean, um, it's not known for its cheap houses.
Yeah. Bay
And
Area housing has been
yeah,
crazy in the last 8, 10 years. And I think we're starting to see demand soften up last 6 months, I would say,
yeah.
especially because of the interest rates. That's the
But
driver.
yeah, some, I'm paying a lot of attention to the real estate market as well. And you know, what hasn't happened, and it kind of clicked for me a little bit, was like, the house that I grew up in, they don't build anymore. Like a starter home, a modest 2-story starter home isn't a thing. Like most entry level detached houses are like more than 2,000 square feet. Like, because builders don't make margin on the smaller ones.
Correct.
So I think, we're going to see a shift to some of those smaller homes eventually, because like you just can't afford it. Like if you're 30 years old now, like, can you afford a 2,000 square foot home? Probably not, especially after student loan debt. So I think we'll see a shift there too, but also there's not enough houses. There's not enough like entry level houses. And, now the millennial generation wants to get out and have kids and not be in their parents' house, and, have a family like people do. And I think we'll see some of that as well. So, my guidance would be to kind of overestimate inflation in general. Um, and then also, like, you have to consider that in your pricing. So I think again, like, you can kind of fudge your pricing. And what I mean by that is like, we're not going to raise prices or whatever when inflation's like 2%, because you can make some productivity gains. But now you're going to have to think through this of like, okay, if my salaries are going to go up, 5% a year or something, which is a lot for the US on average, or maybe they're going to jump because we were talking about the audit industry. So 20 years ago, an auditor made like 50 grand out of college, and 18 years ago, an auditor made 50 grand out of college. And now I think that level is kind of reset because they just ran out of people.
Hmm.
And a lot of, especially COVID, people were like, I'm not going to do audit. Like, I think they had the same view as I did, when I started, was like, maybe that's not for me. I'll try something different. And, and you're going to see like all of a sudden the price of audits went up 40%. And I think they weren't used to that because audit wasn't seen as this value add. Well, apply that to your company, right? Like, what are we doing? If my labor cost goes up, do I need to raise my prices, 5% a year at least? And that's, if I was coaching a business owner, I would say you need to really look at like where your forecasted cost is going to go, because you need to start socializing these price increases with your customers and start putting them in. Um, because you're going to see this kind of erosion of your margins just by inflation. Um, and that probably isn't going to, like, my guess is the interest rates are going to help that a little bit, but some of that's going to be outside of the central bank control. It's not a money supply issue, it's a demographic issue.
Shouldn't something like audit be automated by now? Like, why software has not solved it?
That's a great question. And something I've been thinking about. I think there's a few animals that go into that. One is every company is kind of a little bit different. And so automation is really good when you have the same thing over and over again. But then when you have exceptions, you need a human to come in. Even if you think of like AP automation, where my accounts payable comes in, I should be able to just automate it and it flows. That works like 90% of the time. And then you need a person for 10% of like, oh, it didn't code right or whatever. Audit, there's a few animals. One is you have this group, running IFRS, which is the auditing, like the accounting standards. And it's kind of like taxes, where like taxes never get less complex from year to year. And IFRS always says like their answer to every problem is like, oh, we had a problem, let's make it more complex.
Hmm.
And maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but the standards haven't gotten harder, haven't gotten easier to deal with. They've actually gotten harder. I'm maybe this weird person that would argue we should make the standards simpler and easier to audit what goes in them. Because usually when a big fraud happens, like I don't know, FTX or Enron, like it's not because they didn't report in a complex way. It's because they just broke the law. Like it's very simple. Like no, he just spent money at
Willful
FTX. Like
violation.
Enron just like manipulated accounting until they
Yeah.
couldn't anymore. And it's not like more regulation is going to fix that. Like what would actually fix that, to your point, would be automation, because it's very hard to lie. If all your transactions have to be in the same way and you have to validate it, it's a lot harder to lie than when you get a person involved, because unfortunately people were fallible, and we get tired, and our kids kept us up all last night, and this client's really important and I don't want to lose them, and they're the next big thing, and then all of a sudden they crash. So I think that's probably the main driver, is we keep making it more and more complex, and we don't have that pause where we can just stop and make it simpler. There is a company that's trying to do that, though, out of Montreal. I'm not associated with them, but I like what I've seen out of them so far, called Stamped, I think. So their goal is to try to get this automation done. And I think there's been, like, I guess the second point I would say in this is there's been a lot of automation, I think, that's happened. It's just we don't go from zero to like driving manual cars to all cars are like self-driven overnight. And the same thing for most automation, it's usually steps at a time. So if you think about it, like you can audit now transactions in like AP or whatever, pretty, like there's mechanical ways to do that. There's automated ways to do that. It's just not every piece of the process has been automated yet.
I agree, because there's so much effort that goes into everything else, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what we typically call is a front office. Hey, let's automate customer journeys, and onboarding time should be less. But not a lot of attention is paid to the kitchen or the back office, saying, oh, if the processes are not in place, how are you going to recognize the revenue? How are you going to make more money? How can you outreach to more customers?
Right.
And I keep hearing this theme about how finance is still driven by spreadsheets, and it's the same process for 20 years. So somebody should have looked into it and automated the hell out of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think more and more there is some automation that happens. There's also this I call it the washing machine problem, which I think is pretty famous. And do you know about that?
I haven't.
So okay, we used to hand wash our clothes, and you probably at that time you wore the same thing for about a week, and then you washed it. Then we got washing machines. Great. Now we can wear, takes so much faster. So what do? We just wear more clothes now.
So we
So
invented a solution that gave us more problems than anything else.
right, and I think with analysis though, but there's a lot of great things that we can do with analysis, but sometimes I think companies end up going way too far. It's like, all right, well, did we look at this and did we look at this? And sometimes it's good to look at it once, but then it's hard to have that memory of like, okay, we went down this path of analysis and we found that either it was inconclusive or it didn't really give us anything. Like it's science. It's basically you're doing science, right? Because you don't know and you have a hypothesis and you're trying to prove it. And when you get more and more data, you just have more and more that you can play with. So your time still gets utilized. And
Hmm.
sometimes, you think like, oh, okay, why does it always go into spreadsheets? Well, you can automate certain processes. Like you can automate your close process pretty well, and you can automate accounts payable and accounts receivable. There's a lot of good things that you can actually do, but what does that allow you to do? That allows you to do more.
Hmm.
So I may automate my receivables, and then now I can grow my business. So you kind of get, you have these you have these hurdle points, and once you get past them, then you have a new hurdle point. Like your bottleneck always kind of gets pushed to a different spot. I think on the whole, it's a good thing though, because that means that we're progressing kind of as humans and as companies, and we are more efficient. You probably don't see it from day to day. You think like, oh, these companies are doing spreadsheets. Well, yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time in Excel still, but I spend a lot less time doing mundane tasks in Excel. Like I would tell anybody right now, if you're in school, like learn Power Query, because there's still a ton of systems that throw out really bad data, and that helps you clean data. Like you work an hour to clean data, and then that data from that system is never a problem again. So
Power Query in Excel.
yeah,
Got it.
or Power BI. That's
Power
another
BI.
good outlook too. But again, we added more things. Like dashboarding wasn't a thing until like it really took off maybe 5 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, it was like a cool idea and only like certain software had it. And then you get like a Power BI and a Tableau that comes out. And then I think now people are starting to realize, whoa, we went too far in dashboards because like, yes, I have these really pretty graphs and, I only still look at these three numbers, and that's the essence of, I think, being an executive and running your own business and being more effective is like, what do I really need to look at? Because you can look at a ton of things, but what are the key drivers of your business and how do I make this simple so that I know, okay, my revenue is not hitting my forecast. It's not hitting my forecast because of these reasons. And these are the actions that I need to drive. Always need to drive from like, what am I seeing to what is my action? And anytime you don't have that in a report, like you're probably better off just throwing it out. Because sometimes if you can't do anything about it, why worry? There's other things you can probably fix.
I want to change to something much more
Yeah.
interesting to you. You mentioned about your guitar, and I see one right there in the corner. What's the story there?
Oh, I was in bands for a long time. Like I decided to pick up, yeah, like ever since high school, we had like we even organized a battle of the bands. I don't know how we ended up doing that, but we're like, yeah, we want to, and I think it was just an excuse because we wanted a place to like play. So yeah, I was in bands in like high school and college, and then kind of stopped that because I like I said before, with certain things, once you realize what that life is like, you would be like, well, I could practice all the time, and be on the road, and you know maybe that's not the life that I want. Like it's not as fun it's like not fun to play music once you're there. Like don't make your hobbies your job because then they're not fun anymore. That some people can get away with that, and I definitely wasn't one. And then also I was like, do I really want to like be poor for 20 years and maybe make it, or maybe just do something that's probably a little bit more tried and true. I think I was in that tried and true thing. I still enjoy playing
What do you
from
play?
time to time. Yeah,
What do you play?
like type of music.
Yeah, type of music, any specific genre,
All sorts of things.
covers.
All sorts of things. I think like I still just only have the acoustic now, so I have a pretty broad and eclectic taste in music. Um, Probably one of my favorite bands is Guster. Like they're an East Coast band. Probably nobody knows about them, but like I'll be surprised if anybody listening to the podcast has knowledge of them. But they're probably one of my favorite bands. But I like death metal too. Like when I go hit the gym or something, or just like to clear my head. So wide variety.
So
My
death
favorite,
metal,
yeah,
Anthrax, 80s group.
yeah.
That's
Anthrax is in there. Yeah, they're
uh,
kind of like I have an appreciation for them now. I kind of grew up listening to them in high school too. I don't know, they hit me at the right time, but like just I have a playlist of kind of music that just kind of wakes me up, and gets me moving. So yeah, kind of like I don't know, like a Michael Burry playlist or something from The Big Short, like either that or there's also like one of the more fun bands I was in. We did like alternative country music, so like
hmm.
that was pretty random, but it was a good time. Yeah. So I feel like there's something to music every now and then. It's a good way. It's a good way to get you in a different mind space and kind of stop worrying about the day to day and spreadsheets and numbers and figures and stuff.
Got it.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this conversation, what would you recommend, knowing the times we are in, the macro that we are in? If I am a 10 plus year in my career finance professional, what should I do?
Well, I think one of the things I would go back and do differently, and am still working on now, but like have a strategy for your career, because most of us don't do that. Most of us don't sit down and say like strategically, what do I want as a person, and that's different for all of us. Like some people want to retire earlier, some people want to I have an ambition to do this, to own my own business. Like figure out what you want, and then strategically, how am I going to get there? Like I think that's the first step. And then after you've sorted that out, that can kind of be your guiding light of like, am I moving towards my goals? Like, am I moving in my strategy or away from my strategy? And that gives you a lens to think of, okay, am I doing, like, if I'm working in this job that I have right now, is it helping me or not? Because sometimes you go in a job and you're like, okay, I've been here 2 years. I've kind of hit that S curve. Like, do I need to look for something else or get promoted in the company or maybe take even a lateral move to learn something else? Or am I happy here? Because my plan may be like, well, I just want to earn money and then, work 20 years and retire. And that's perfectly fine. And you may be like, well, I'm in a good position. I'm making money. I know what I'm doing. Like, my kids are, I get to see my kids' ball games. That's great. And if that's your strategy, that means you're executing your strategy, and that's perfect. It can give you some comfort that, like, hey, what I'm doing is right. Or you could say, like, well, like, I'm younger, I don't have kids yet, I'm really ambitious, I want to get to a higher level, I want to learn some new things. Then, like, maybe you're in that role and you should be like, you could be like, all right, maybe I'm better off doing something different. So I think the number one thing is actually build your career strategy like you would strategize for a company.
Got it. That's a fantastic career advice, Scott. Thank you for your time, and fantastic chatting with you. With that, we'll wrap up this. And where can people find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. Hopefully we can put something in the show notes, but
Yep.
Scott Meyers CPA is the handle there. That's probably the best place to get a hold of me. Just connect and feel free to send me a message. I actually do talk to people and reach out. So
great. That is Scott Meyers on our podcast today, CFO of React Gaming.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Chief Future Officer Podcast. The Chief Future Officer Podcast is brought to you by Quolum, a CFO's best buddy to buy and manage SaaS. To support this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast application. Links to previous episodes and the rest of the show notes are in the bio, and I'd love to have you check out other episodes. Lastly, if you want to be on this podcast or recommend a friend, let us know in the comments below. Thank you.